Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. Today, we're going to kickstart our conversation about the time period after the Civil War that we call Reconstruction. Of course, we're talking about the Civil War being over, and we're going to get into how do we rebuild the country, how do we reunite it, and also, of course, how do we bring about the South back into the Union and rebuild its economy. So, in this first section, we're going to talk a little bit about the debate over Reconstruction and what that looks like. And unfortunately, this unit begins with tragedy with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which we'll also get into today. So what are we going to be able to do today? Our learning target, main idea, is we're going to be able to explain how government leaders disagreed about how the process in which Southern states were going to rejoin the Union. So this time period is really defined by this idea that Americans they're not in complete agreement about how to do and reconstruct the country when the Civil War is over. And so part of it is rebuilding the Southern economy, which has just been decimated by the Civil War, and certainly also a lot of the landscape and a lot of the infrastructure that the South's economy was built on prior to the Civil War. A lot of it has been destroyed because, remember, a majority of the war is fought in the South and in the Confederacy. And also, how do you rebuild society? You have this entire new group of people who have perhaps never known freedom are now have freedom, and how do you bring them back into society? And so on top of that, how do you bring the Confederate states, which have been in rebellion, which created their own nation, which have fought against the Union, how do you bring them back into the Union, and how do you do it in a way that you can move forward? So again, this time period that we're talking about is called Reconstruction, which makes sense. We got to build it back together, and the goal, of course, is to make it better than it was before. So it's the reorganization, it's the rebuilding of the former Confederate states after the Civil War, and it's about bringing the Union back together. So when I say that there was physical destruction, I just wanted to show you guys a couple of examples. We're literally talking about the destruction of homes, and we talked about Atlanta being almost burned to the ground, and we need to physically rebuild it, not just the economy, not just the society, but we need to physically brick and mortar. We need to rebuild bridges, and we need to put that back together in order to help the South rebuild and recover. And remember, that alone is a tall task, but you have that on top of the economy and the society that need to be rebuilt in those places as well. And so before his assassination, Lincoln is advocating for something called the 10% plan, which basically said that and again, this is his plan for allowing Southern states that were in the Confederacy to rejoin the Union. So it doesn't include our border states because they never left the Union during the Civil War, but it's our states that left and joined the Confederate States of America. Once 10% of voters took an oath of loyalty to the United States of America and adopted a new constitution that included the 13th Amendment, the ban on slavery, they could rejoin the Union. And so during this time period, you've got three states. You've got Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee that all set up governments under this plan in 1864. Okay, so prior to the end of the Civil War. But again, you're starting to see certainly some of that on the wall as we got closer. And Lincoln, in that plan, also wants to offer amnesty, and this is one of our vocab words for this unit. This is a granting of pardon to a large number of persons or people, and it gives protection from prosecution, so being charged criminally with a crime for any illegal acts that took place during the Civil War. So essentially it's offering some of these white Southerners the opportunity for a fresh start, a clean start, and an opportunity to rebuild after the war is over for themselves and, of course, for their states. And what they needed to do was swear loyalty to the Union. But this was also certainly did not include Confederate leaders. There would be different parameters for that because amnesty wasn't going to be granted to them because of their role. Now, remember that Lincoln is a Republican, and not all the Republicans are going to agree with him. Thaddeus Stevens in particular, as well as some others, but he would certainly be one of our more prominent figures. He is known as a radical Republican, and we would perhaps use that radical as a little bit more extreme form of the Republican Party at this time period. And he considered Lincoln's plan a little too forgiving. He wanted to punish the South more, and he favored an approach that would have been a little bit more radical or extreme in its approach, in wanting to make sure that the southern states would never try something like this again. And so certainly even within the Republican Party at this time period, there's still debate as far as how to do this. You also have the Wade-Davis bill that gets passed by Congress in 1864, and it also reflected a little bit more of those radical ideas from the Republican Party about tougher requirements to bring the Confederates back into the Union, to bring those rebelling states back in. Lincoln refused to sign this bill, and he vetoed it. And you certainly see that Lincoln wants to try to perhaps accelerate this process, start the healing, and start the recovering a little bit more quickly. And radical Republicans, on the other hand, are a little bit more scared that that will lead to perhaps future insurrection or future acts of rebellion. So Lincoln and Congress, while this, that debate internally is going on, they are going to set up the Freedmen's Bureau, because you do have this group of African Americans, some of which have never known freedom, who are now going to be put into society, and they're going to have a new role. And so it needs to be a little bit more thought of as to what does that look like. And so Lincoln and Congress are hoping to set up a part of the government, which is going to be called the Freedmen's Bureau, newly freed slaves, to help them adjust to that new freedom and to help them find their place. And of course, you're going to see that it's kind of going to be the federal government standing between these newly freed slaves and newly enfranchised African Americans with their white counterparts in both the North and the South, and trying to create a society in which everybody can thrive, everybody can have success. So, of course, with the tragedy of Lincoln's assassination, we're going to talk briefly about this, and we'll talk about it more in class, is that what this brings about is a change in leadership and a change in the idea of what Reconstruction is going to be. Andrew Johnson, who was a part of the Democratic Party in Missouri, was brought onto the ticket in order to bring more unity to the ticket for election in 1864. Wasn't Lincoln's necessarily his first choice, but he knew that it needed to be done in order to kind of bring the country together. And Johnson's going to be thrust into this. He's not going to have the same leadership skills as Lincoln, and he is going to kind of announce his plan for restoration. And again, he's going to battle radical Republicans for this. John Wilkes Booth and these three men are all sympathizers of the Confederate ideas and the frustration that many former Confederate soldiers are feeling. And they take it upon themselves to send a message that, this bitterness is still there, and they don't want Lincoln, because they see him as too radical, to change anything more than he already has. And so Lincoln makes his way to Ford Theater to go and watch the play Our American Cousin. And during the third act, in the second scene, there's a quote in the play that says, "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. And so it's during that period that John Wilkes Booth enters in with his gun, and it's at this point that he pulls the trigger, and Lincoln is shot. He jumps down off the balcony, and of course he is trying to escape, and there's a long manhunt for him. Immediately after, Lincoln is brought into a bed in the White House where he's tended to, and he's surrounded by family, he's surrounded by his cabinet, but unfortunately he is going to die shortly afterwards, and this is the actual bed in which he died, and this is the pillow where his head lay when he died. So from Washington, D.C., you're going to see the journey to try to evade. And so certainly some people were providing Booth with a series of kind of different hideouts because they were perhaps sympathizing, because remember, a lot of people in the Confederacy do not like Lincoln, and they wanted to perhaps see him dead. Where this all ends is at Garrett Farm. Essentially, Union soldiers trap him in the barn. It's at this point Booth is by himself. They set the barn on fire, and he comes out, and then he is actually shot through a window and brought out into a mattress. And his last words are essentially, "Tell my mother that I died for my country." And he's referring, of course, to the Confederacy, but little does he know that his country is gone. So Lincoln's funeral train is, it begins in Washington, D.C., and has several stops along the way. You can see a couple of them here, like in Pennsylvania, New York City, certainly Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, eventually to Chicago, before he's finally laid to rest in Springfield. So, again, Lincoln is assassinated by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, and this again takes place April 14th, 1865. And so with that, the new president would be the vice president at the time, who's Andrew Johnson, and he's going to become president now. And again, his plan for Reconstruction is more restoration, to restore things. And so by the end of 1865, all the Confederate states, with the exception of Texas, have new governments. They've ratified the 13th Amendment, and they are ready to join the Union. So perhaps a very quick pace. And so you're going to see, again, some divide on how to do this between radical Republicans and Johnson. So what did the 13th Amendment accomplish? Look at the options here. Think about it. Pause here if you need to, but just to make sure moving forward, because, of course, 13th Amendment being very important. So the options, again, are: it welcomed former Confederate soldiers back into the Union, Confederate states. B, it made secession illegal. C, it pardoned Confederate leaders. Or D, it abolished slavery throughout the Union, with the exception of as a punishment for a crime. So the best answer here is D. Okay. So that's going to wrap up this first section on Reconstruction. For my students, make sure you've been following along with guide notes. Ask any questions that you may still have. Those of you who are listening, really appreciate you taking the time. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.